On debate, Senator Dawson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Today, I rise again and have the pleasure to speak with you at third reading of C-11, the Online Streaming Act. Modernizing the Broadcasting Act is a key legislative priority for the government. This bill will clarify that online streamers are subject to the Act and will update the CRTC's toolkit to put in place a new regulatory framework.
Modernizing the Act means bringing it up to date with today's reality and setting the stage for the future. This must be done in a way that takes into account our current reality, a reality where digital technology is becoming more and more important in people's lives, a reality that sees a variety of business models in today's Canadian broadcasting system. The Act must therefore establish an up-to-date regulatory framework with clear direction, the necessary tools, and the flexibility to remain relevant.
Date of the Broadcasting Act dates to 1991, and as we all have seen, since 1991, there has been tremendous change in the broadcasting sector. The arrival of the Internet and new digital technologies has changed the way we communicate with each other and the way we consume our culture. And more recently, with pandemic, we have seen how technology has taken a huge place in our daily lives, and it is clear that this reality will not change. The sector has undergone change at an unprecedented pace. The majority of Canadians now turn to online streaming services to access their favorite music, their favorite movies, and their favorite TV shows. Services like Netflix, Spotify, Crave, CBC Gem, Club Illico are household names alongside the traditional services of radio, television, and cable. And these traditional services remain important, especially to certain demographics. Canadians stream 2 billion songs in a single week, using services like Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Music. According to a survey conducted by La Disque, 61% of respondents said they listen to music online services like Spotify and Apple Music. But that does not mean that online broadcasters have replaced traditional broadcasters. In that same survey, 60% of respondents noted that they use the radio as a tool for discovering music. Make no mistake, though the consumption of media has changed, it has not come close to replacing traditional broadcasting. What hasn't changed, however, is our regulatory system, and it desperately needs to be updated. The General Director of La Disque, Eve Paré, testified before us at the committee undertaking the study at Transport and Communication, and I quote, "The situation is a concern for creators and producers, but also for public who are very attached to their culture. In that same survey, we learned that 73% of Quebecers believe that the government should adopt legislation so that services such as Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube also have to contribute to funding this content. In addition, 70% of those who stream music say they would like to have recommendations of French language music from Quebec." End of quote.
Streaming services have had a significant impact on our broadcasting system for a number of years. The reality is that satellite and cable services are losing subscribers. The broadcasting system has lost revenue, advertisers, and viewers to online services. Yet, despite all this, the Act has not changed. The government and parliamentarians have worked carefully on this bill for a very long time, and many citizens and organizations have contributed to it. This demonstrates how important the subject is. The Senate has performed its work. In the last few months, we have had important conversations, hearing from over 130 witnesses who have come to talk to us about this bill. Colleagues, I thank you for your comprehensive work. Now we need to pass the streaming legislation to support our creators, our cultural industries, and all Canadians.
C-11 is part of a broader set of initiatives brought forward by the government to create forward-thinking digital policy agenda, including the Online News Act that we talked about a few minutes ago, and the government's commitment to address online safety. Bill 11 aligns with other acts and legislative instruments and respects the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It also helps Canadians fulfill their international commitments, such as the UNESCO Convention on Diversity of Cultural Expressions and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It is important that we modernize the broadcasting framework. This is the task at hand. It has been almost 2 years since C-10 was introduced to modernize the Broadcasting Act. And I am therefore before you again in 2021. We had this bill C-10 before us. I remarked at that time that neither the government nor I had the intention of ramming this legislation through the Senate. And here we are in 2023, and 20 months later, as you can see, some people doubt it, but I was telling the truth. Before C-10 in June 2018, the Government of Canada appointed a panel to review the broadcasting and telecommunications legislative framework. That panel studied these issues for 2 years and published a report called Canada's Communications Future, Time to Act. They received over 2,000 written submissions. That same year, it turns out, my colleagues and I on the Transport and Communications Committee began a study on this topic, but we deferred to the national panel's study. With the commitment reported on Bill C-11 presented to this chamber in late 2022, we have finally finished this study. When I rose to introduce Bill C-10, I noted that the bill had already received considerable input, with at that time 112 days at committee stage at the Standing Committee of Canadian Heritage, with over 40 meetings and close to 50 witnesses, not counting departmental briefings. The bill reflected the work done by parliamentarians and sustainable input from industry and community stakeholders. Collectively, the interested parties recognized the need to modernize the Act, even as their opinions may differ on the details. As this bill reaches us today, C-11 has received even more input. As tabled, the bill builds upon the work done on C-10 during the last session, with targeted changes to social media and some technical amendments. Parliamentarians once again had the opportunity to amend the bill during the House of Commons clause-by-clause study. Senators once again had the opportunity to study this bill. As I said earlier, we have had many witnesses come before us at the Transport Committee. And as promised, C-10, neither I nor the government pushed to ram this bill through. In fact, we welcomed an expansive study and heard from every single person and group that requested to testify, every single one. Your faithful committee and I patiently and openly listened to their requests, their opinions, and their concerns. We listened to professors, lawyers, cultural sectors, associations, unions, researchers, consumer groups, official languages minority committee, government regulators, taxpayer federations, digital creators, traditional broadcasters, independent broadcasters, online streaming services, etc., etc. So, as you can see, a lot of people gave their opinion, and we're quite proud of the report that was adopted. Your committee and I listened patiently to 138 witnesses, over 31 meetings totaling 67 hours and 30 minutes. We listened patiently, and when we heard the confusion and misinformation surrounding the bill at the end of the study, we then heard from the government officials who put to rest many of the misconceptions that had been put on the table. D'autre part,
moreover, the concerns expressed about the risk of streaming to the broadcasting sector are neither new nor hypothetical, but it is important to consider the facts in context, because the decision not to impose requirements on online services dates back to the last century. At that time, these services had relatively little impact on the broadcasting sector. It was also important to allow innovative, nascent services to develop. Today, this is obviously no longer the case. The world has changed, and it is urgent that the imbalance in the interim caused by the lack of regulation be addressed to ensure that the web giants contribute their fair share to the support of Canadian music and stories, including in the same way that traditional Canadian broadcasters do.
Suggested that this bill will result in foreign players withdrawing from the Canadian market. This is not the case. In fact, we have observed the opposite. These platforms, more than 75 online streaming services, including the big ones we all know, are available in Canada. More are coming, and their content libraries are growing. Online streamers compete directly with the regulatory broadcasters. In some cases, due to licensing, the only way Canadian consumers can view the latest and most popular series is in tenfold franchises like the Andar, the Lord of the Rings of Power, is through streaming services. Even Kim's Convenience and Schitt's Creek Content commissioned by the CBC is being watched by Canadians on platforms like Netflix instead of Canadian services like GEM. In the past, when Canadian broadcasters licensed foreign programming, these services in turn supported Canadian programming through regulatory obligations. However, streaming services are not presently required to support the broadcasting system as traditional Canadian broadcasters do. This is the problem that requires urgent action, and that is the one that the Online Streaming Act directly addresses. This is not a quick cash grab or a punishment to those who have enjoyed success in an unregulated environment. The Online Streaming Act is not about picking winners and losers in the landscape of Canada's broadcasting system. It does not compromise the personal freedom of Canadians or does not censor the internet. This is about updating our laws and regulations to revamp the framework of our broadcasting system for today and for tomorrow. It is about providing the certainty and structure for substantial success in the future. What it does is simple. The legislation accounts for the realities of modern broadcasting and ensures a level playing field where all commercial players materially contribute to attaining the objectives of the Broadcasting Act. This bill is asking platforms that benefit from Canadian culture to contribute to our culture. Our chamber has an important role to play within our democratic process and has performed that role admirably. We studied its merits and aims to better understand how it will work and why it is important. We have carefully listened to every point of view that has been presented, and ours is only one part of the process. Following this work, consultations will be held with everybody that wants to participate, and that is by design in this bill. Many of our colleagues have raised important issues throughout the study of the bill. I hope that they will continue their engagement on these issues through the consultation process. At a high level, the Online Streaming Act addresses many important issues. The Online Streaming Act advances the interest of Canada and Canadians in several ways. Canadian broadcasters compete on an uneven regulatory playing field. Right now, Canadian broadcasters are subject to the full extent of Canada's broadcasting regulations, and online streamers are not. The Online Streaming Act is critical for sustaining the support ecosystem for Canadian culture, music, stories, by level the playing field and ensuring the health of our cultural broadcasting sector. It is needed to secure sustainable investment in Canadian stories, both for TV and film. It is recognized by music stakeholders as critical to supporting and making discoverable our music and songs in all of our languages, as it provides space within our broadcasting system for our communities that have faced systematic marginalization. Equity-seeking groups deserve to see themselves represented on screen and to have the opportunities to fill key creative roles in Canadian productions. As the Minister said, the Online Streaming Act is not about regulating what people post online. This has been made very clear time and time again. Rather, it is about seeking an equitable contribution from all big streaming services that are in the business of distributing commercial content. I'd like to highlight the word equitable here. As we heard during our study from both the CRTC and government officials, contributions can take many number of ways that are not necessarily monetary. I quote, with respect to expenditure requirements, that money is never transferred. An expenditure requirement stays within the company. It is essentially an investment obligation on their part to invest in Canadian production, but they still retain control in the decision-making over what they will do. We do expect some services, because they might not have a big production footprint here or otherwise, that their contribution may look more like what we do for cable and satellite companies, which is a contribution to a cultural production fund, such as the Canada Media Fund. These revenues, though, do not go to the department. That transfer is overseen by the CRTC, and that money is remitted directly to the Canadian Media Fund, for example. We also heard from both officials and stakeholders themselves that they already contribute to our cultural entertainment sector in a variety of ways. This debate comes at a pivotal moment. After transformative innovations in the early internet area, we are amidst with new wave of digital revolution. The government will ensure that technologies work for, not against, our democratic institution, and importantly, that they will further Canadian cultural interest. The overreaching objective remains to ensure continuing support for Canadian stories, music, and culture in a sector that is increasingly saturated by foreign online streaming services and web giants. The Standing Committee on Transport and Communication has listened carefully to various groups of stakeholders and working together, members of this chamber have developed proposals to future improve the bills. And I'm sure some more amendments might come forward over the next few days. Amendments from all parties and groups were proposed and adopted. No voice was shut out, no witnesses nor any of our colleagues was not heard. Our broadcasting regulatory framework is out of date. Its application is uneven, and this imbalance will continue to hurt our creative industries until this legislation is passed and the thoughtful process is completed. An imbalanced system does not serve the interests of Canada nor Canadians and limits our ability to realize the cultural and broadcasting policy objectives that the Broadcasting Act is ultimately meant to protect. The government is asking us to work together to see this bill through the legislative process in a timely fashion, in the interest of our artists, our creators, and Canadians altogether. I believe we are doing precisely that. And while appropriately listening, considering, and providing our sober second thought, we must update our legislation to reflect the reality of digital distribution in the centre. Honourable Senators, we are faced with an important task. Writing the regulatory... Pardon? I'll try not to interrupt you when you speak, Senator. Honourable Senators, we are faced with an important task, writing the regulatory asymmetry between traditional and online broadcasting undertakings that has been delayed for so long. I personally wrote in 1982 that policy initiatives at that time were designed to develop greater appreciation for Canada's rich social, historic, and cultural heritage. The goals I wrote about at that time remain true today. The regulations of that day, however, are outdated. The process around modernizing the Broadcasting Act has seen considerable, remarkable debate and discussion. In some cases, prevailing misconceptions and fears that have occurred have obscured the real issues. These misconceptions have time and time again been discussed, analyzed, and rejected.
I am well aware of the concerns in some quarters at this time regarding Bill C-11. It is time to move on to solutions. We need to address this regulatory challenge now by requiring that online audio and video broadcasting services contribute to our culture in the same way that traditional broadcasters have always done. Remember that under the 1991 Broadcasting Act, traditional broadcasting undertakings had to be owned and controlled by Canadians and licensed. They could, and still can, broadcast programs from the international market or broadcast American channels. In return for their participation in the Canadian broadcasting system and their access to the domestic market, these undertakings were required to finance, acquire, and broadcast Canadian programs. They were also required to make programming available to Canadians and to contribute to the creation of Canadian programming, including, of course, in French.
By accident. It was intentional and it worked. Our broadcasting system saw an increase in demand for Canadian programs. Our creative talent flourished and our cultural industries saw predictable investment on which they could plan to build and grow. However, the support system for our stories and music has been eroding as revenues shift away from traditional broadcasters to online streaming services. This puts the support system for Canadian stories and music at risk. Honourable colleagues, a primary goal of the renewed approach to regulating is to provide sustainable support for Canadian music and stories in the years ahead. The bill aims for fair treatment of programs consumed on different platforms, regardless of how they are transmitted. New legislation will shift away from issuing broadcasting licenses to a new condition of service model. This provides the CRTC with a new and more flexible way to seek contributions from broadcasters and to impose other conditions, including conditions related to discoverability and showcasing of Canadian programs. The latter is particularly important for Canadian musical artists, particularly French-speaking artists and others trying to compete in an industry dominated by heavyweights. In this framework, broadcasting undertakings, including online undertakings, would be required to make financial contributions to support Canadian music, stories, creators, and producers. I'd like to address two notable themes that the bill that merits some clear and specific mention here. They are the treatment of digital-first creators and the approach to social media. The bill is clear that digital-first creators are not considered to be broadcasting undertakings. A producer of audio-visual content that is primarily produced and intended for online distribution as a user-uploaded content social media service will be excluded. Some critics of the bill have suggested that 30% of the digital-first creators' revenues could be contributed to art fund. This is simply not true. Digital-first creators, I repeat, will not be required to make financial contributions to supporting Canadian content. Large social medias will be asked to contribute to Canadian music storytelling if they provide commercial content such as music and TV shows. You've heard many examples raised during this debate. Since digital-first creators are exempt, their revenues will not be used to calculate the contributions that social media make to support Canadian content. Additionally, digital-first creators will not be subject to discoverability or showcasing requirements. Despite, again, what some critics of the bill have claimed, the government has heard the concerns of digital-first creators and is responding to them through a recalibrated approach to social media. Discoverability can also come in a variety of forms, as we have heard during the study of the committee. Discovery is an objective, and the CRTC will be empowered to consult with the industry stakeholders to set out what discovery looks like in an online space. Whatever it looks like, digital creators will not be subject to those regulations as they are exempt from the bill. As the Minister has said many times, platforms in, users out. I said that in my speech last year. I'm saying it in my speech again this year. In summation, these provisions ensure that social media services contribute to the Canadian broadcasting system in a fair and equitable manner when they provide the same services as traditional broadcasters and other online streamers. At the same time, it can be done in a way that respects the rights and freedoms and choices of Canadians online. To help understand why action is urgently needed, let's look at the current economic reality in the sector.
Broadcasting is an important economic engine, supporting Canada's creative industries and evolving cultural identity. Together, Canada's broadcasting, film and video, and music and sound recording sectors contribute $14 billion to Canada's GDP and over 160,000 jobs, which just tells you how important the sector is. Yet, over the past decade, the number of subscribers to streaming services has grown from 6 to 78% of Canadians. Even in recent years, streaming services have experienced rapid and substantial revenue growth, while conventional broadcasters have seen their revenues decline.
After all, we know that the world of broadcasting has changed. In addition to this new reality, Canadian broadcasting sector is facing long-term structural change. Without intervention, current trends in the market are expected to result in a decline of the production of Canadian television content. In 2020, we had already seen $320 million drop in productions compared to the 2018 levels. Sustainable long-term support for this system is required to enable ongoing success for Canadian creators, producers, and broadcasters. That is what the modernization is about. That is what the Streaming Act will achieve. Le status quo est inacceptable.
The status quo is unacceptable.
It's the main element of this legislation. Ensuring the continued viability of the Canadian broadcasting system is also about our cultural sovereignty. Culture can play a role in the process of truth-telling and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and healing.
These are among the cultural policy issues that the Online Broadcasting Act addresses. Ensuring that our broadcasting system is more equitable more inclusive, that it supports the livelihoods of Canadian artists and creators, that it supports the lives of Canadians who want to see more of themselves on screen and in song.
These gains are a cornerstone for the survival of community media, local news, French language, and racialized communities, and third language programming, and so much more. We have heard at committee that this legislation will give these content producers more breathing room in the space that they occupy. We have heard from witnesses that foreign broadcasters need to play the same rules as local broadcasters. Kevin Desjardins, president of the Canadian Association of Broadcast, said it best when he testified at committee, and I quote, "Canadian broadcasters are desperate for regulatory clarity and certainty. They need to know that the rules that they and their foreign competitors will be operating under to plan their business, and they need to know the rules will be fair and equitable. Canadian broadcasters are willing to compete, but they cannot do so in a system that allows increasing dominant players to take as much as they want and only to give as much as they like." End of quote. Furthermore, this legislation also aims to ensure a space within our broadcasting system for Indigenous storytelling and Indigenous languages. Monica L., the Chief Executive Office of the Aboriginal Television Network, told our committee, and again I quote, "There are also additional references in this bill to support Indigenous language programming. The regulatory policy in paragraph 5 of the Broadcasting Act will require the CRTC to take into account the different characteristics of French, English, and Indigenous language broadcasting, as well as the needs and interests of Indigenous people. This is the first time Indigenous language content has been placed on an equal footing with English and French language content in the Act." End of quote. Colleagues, we are truly making progress with this Act. Honourable Senator.
Honourable Senators, I would like to review the process that will take place after third reading of this bill. If we pass legislation that is different from what is passed in the other place, Bill C-11 will be sent back to this chamber for consideration of our amendments. The House of Commons has the option of either accepting all of our amendments, some of them, or none of them. Whichever they do, we will receive a message from the other place informing us of their decision. Our goal is to agree on the same piece of legislation. Once that is achieved, the bill will receive royal assent. Then the government will issue a policy directive to the CRTC. A policy directive is often used to direct an organization on how to implement important policies. The CRTC's policy directive will indicate priorities for the implementation of the new regulatory framework. The policy directive has two main objectives. First, it will emphasize the importance of consultation and special consideration of the needs of equity groups. Secondly, the policy directive will make clear where regulation is needed and also where caution is needed. Following the release of the policy directive, all stakeholders, including members of the public, will have at least 30 days to provide comments. Allow me to emphasize, we are implementing a regulatory process just as in other sectors. This means that there will be publication of the proposed policy directives, followed by an opportunity for members of the public to comment. And then the final policy directive will be published. The CRTC, in turn, will have its own public process as it develops measures to implement the legislation. This will be done within clear boundaries established by the legislation and in accordance with the policy directive provided. In summary, before the legislation is implemented, the CRTC will receive policy guidance from the government. This policy directive will have two goals: to emphasize the need for public consultation with members of marginalized communities. The other goal is to highlight clearly the areas where regulation is required. Through hearings, members of the public will then have the opportunity to comment. The final policy directive will then be published. The CRTC will begin implementing the legislation through its own process. This is what we heard during committee sessions. Here is what Mr. Ripley from the Department of Heritage shared with us at the Transport and Communications Committee with regard to the process. I quote, "Once the bill receives royal assent, the CRTC will begin its regulatory processes and hearings to put in place the necessary regulatory instruments to bring streaming platforms into the system. As a practical matter, the CRTC is accustomed to holding such hearings. It will issue a notice and request proposals on the form that the regulations should take. All interested parties will be able to participate in these processes, including streaming platforms, Canada's arts community, and groups representing the public interest. The CRTC will then make a decision, which it will make public." The Broadcasting Online Act offers many opportunities. It has the potential to reach a greater diversity of perspectives, to achieve and cement gains for many communities, and to ensure inclusive support within our broadcasting sector. The Canadian broadcasting sector is very diverse. We are fortunate indeed to have content producers who come from diverse backgrounds. I'm thinking, for example, of Out TV, which offers LGBTQ+ content, or APTN, which offers Indigenous content. The Broadcasting Online Act will give Canadians the opportunity to diversify the content they consume. To provide greater diversity of perspectives and inclusive support that represents and aligns with our communities and Canadians of diverse backgrounds, we must have a broadcasting system that reflects the importance of diversity and inclusion. It is important to know that Bill C-11 addresses a long-standing and pressing issue: the imbalances in Canadian broadcasting for equity-seeking groups who never received that support.
Our broadcasting system by including an explicit broadcasting policy objective requiring that it includes all Canadians. Another strengthened objective requires that accessibility and barrier-free programming be provided. Accessible and inclusive broadcasting is not an afterthought. They are the foundational pillars on which to build. En matière de diversité et d'inclusion,
in terms of diversity and inclusion, one of the objectives of Bill C-11 is to focus on diverse and marginalized voices. For example, Indigenous peoples, racialized people, LGBTQI+ communities, persons with disabilities, and women must be represented on screen and behind the scenes. Historically, these voices have been underrepresented in our broadcasting system. The aim is to expand to the choice of content for all viewers and listeners who find it difficult to identify with content that reflects little or no reality for them. To achieve this goal, the broadcasting system must support and promote programming and creators from diverse communities and backgrounds.
Cannot be updated without ensuring that all Canadians from diverse communities and backgrounds see themselves reflected and supported. While some lament that niche markets will be lost, this is simply not true. The proposed legislation makes space for all. It cements what we are as a country that not only invites diversity, but encourages and supports its creation. Broadcasting reform can support First Nations, Inuit, and Métis storytelling, music, and culture. The government has listened to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The need to focus on Indigenous storytelling, narrative sovereignty, and content creation is clear. Bill C-11 will see important improvements to Canada's broadcasting system to better reflect our relationship with Indigenous peoples for, I repeat, the first time. In particular, the broadcasting framework will make space regardless of resource availability for diverse nations, Métis, and Inuit perspectives. Indigenous communities are ready to produce and broadcast more content. What they lacked before C-11 was the resources. I quote the co-executive director of Indigenous Screen Office, Jess Wente, and I quote, "To us, the central focus should be modernizing the definitions associated with broadcasting and broadcast undertakings, ensuring that this is equitable access and support for marginalized communities, and that there be specific support for Indigenous storytelling and Indigenous language broadcasting. We believe new platforms, even those based outside Canada, should contribute to support Canadian storytelling, and there should be dedicated support for Indigenous storytelling. End of quote. Colleagues, this is what C-11 will achieve. Bill C-11 removes the previous limitation, and I quote, as resources have become available for purpose. End of quote. With respect to providing programming that reflects the cultures of Canada within our broadcasting system, and this is how it should be. It should always have been this way. New technologies and platforms can aid the revitalization of Indigenous language. It's heartbreaking to know that many of our Indigenous languages, such as Oneida, Cayuga, and Seneca, are on the brink of extinction, according to the UNESCO Atlas of the World's Language in Danger Project. Ensuring space for Indigenous people to have narrative sovereignty is important, and it will support our efforts to revitalize Indigenous language. Modernizing the Act includes changes to help Indigenous people tell their stories from their own viewpoint and perspective and to see themselves represented in our broadcasting system. This bill emphasizes the importance of Indigenous-controlled broadcasting services and production. French language programming is also a cornerstone of broadcasting future. Le projet de loi
Bill C-11 strengthens original French language content and production that should not rely solely on dubbing and subtitling. Both traditional and online broadcasters must promote original French language content on their platforms. More and more voices are being raised to note that the foreign offer is predominantly in English and disproportionate to the offer of content and original production in French. And yet, the needs of Francophone communities are very great across the country. We heard at committee how satisfied official language minority community advocacy organizations are with the language provisions included in Bill C-11. The executive director of the Alliance des producteurs francophones du Canada, Carole-Anne Pilon, shared this with the committee. To quote her, the APFC welcomed the historic scope of Bill C-11 on the Canadian audiovisual ecosystem, particularly the formal consideration of OLMCs, which now assigns objectives to the broadcasting system as a whole to reflect their particular situation and needs. I see that Senator Cormier is listening to this paragraph with great attention. Thanks to an agreement between Quebec's leading film distributor, Les Films Civils, and the streaming services, Netflix Canada, Club Illico, and EC2 TV, our favorite French language films can reach new audiences and generate new revenues. Opportunities like these and many others will continue to arise for the French language creative market as the world becomes aware of its vibrant voice. As a senator from Quebec, it is particularly important for me to ensure that the Quebec market is continues to be supported. I would also like to talk about the reality of OLMCs, official language minority situations. These are communities in crisis when it comes to broadcasting. The legislation meets the needs and interests of Francophone and Anglophone communities that are living in a minority situation across the whole country that now want to be identified and named in the legislation in order to ensure their vibrancy and their long-term development. I'm nearly done, friends.
English and French-speaking minority communities. The legislation clarifies that any interpretation and application of the Act must respect the federal government's desire to enhance the vitality of these communities and to support the development as well as the recognition and use of official languages in Canadian society. CRTC must also enhance the presentation of programs created and produced by these communities, in addition to taking into account their specific needs and interests. Le système de radiodiffusion est...
The broadcasting system, including the new online players, are indispensable vessels for the transmission of language and culture in Canada.
Honourable Senators, we must act now. Our artists are a source of inspiration, breathing life and energy in our different communities on a daily basis. They revitalize the spirit of our culture. They elevate and celebrate our heritage as Canadians. They make us laugh, they move us, and they make us reflect on who we are. They have been there for us. We have to stand up for them. To put it simply, the goal of the bill is to promote and protect our culture in the digital age. It is clear that we need to modernize the Broadcasting Act. The bill has broad support across Canada's cultural industries. Moreover, this bill is in the public interest. It is about making sure that we continue to uphold Canadian values in our society as technology and consumer habits evolve. After all, we are not citizens as people, as well as consumers and audiences. Comme à l'habitude,
as the Minister of Canadian Heritage used to say, a day without culture would be a dull day indeed, and I agree with him. The world is watching what we're doing. We are in the process of charting a course. I hope that together we will be part of the solution.
Your committee and I have listened patiently to everyone that wished to be heard. The Canadian broadcasting and cultural sectors have also been waiting patiently. Colleagues, I believe that we have been patient enough. Now it's time to act and to pass this bill. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.